Welcome to Episode 9, Part 1 of the Diplomacy and Discourse channel, where we begin a multi-part series exploring one of the most enduring forces in international relations: power politics. In this 3 to 4 part series, we'll trace the evolution of how empires, states, and leaders have used force, diplomacy, ideology, and economic leverage to shape the world. Part 1 takes us through the foundational history of power politics, from the ruthless military campaigns of the Assyrian Empire to the ideological clashes of the 20th century. We'll examine how monarchs in the Middle Ages refined their use of warfare and religion for legitimacy, how industrial and ideological forces collide in the world wars, and how the Cold War institutionalized power projection through alliances, proxy wars, and nuclear deterrence. Each era offers a lens into the logic of domination, survival, and strategic calculation that still defines global politics today. The Assyrian Empire's use of power politics was rooted in military supremacy and psychological warfare. Their campaigns were often brutal, aimed at instilling fear in enemies and rebellious subjects alike. Kings such as Ashurnapishpal II recorded their atrocities, flaying rebels, erecting piles of skulls, and burying cities as a warning to others. These publicized displays of terror were intentional, functioning not just as punishment but as a deterrent against defiance. Their goal was to prevent rebellion through intimidation, reducing the need for constant military intervention. The Assyrians also excelled in logistics and communication. They built an extensive network of roads and way stations that allowed for the rapid movement of troops and information. This infrastructure was crucial for controlling distant territories and responding swiftly to unrest. Their use of relay riders to transmit messages across the empire was an early form of bureaucratic command and control, reflecting how tightly organized the imperial apparatus had become. Administratively, the Assyrians implemented a centralized system where appointed governors reported directly to the king. These officials collected taxes, enforced laws, and maintained order. To weaken local loyalties and ensure obedience, the Assyrians frequently relocated entire communities, resettling skilled laborers and elites from one region to another. These deportations served as a dual function. They punished dissent and helped develop underpopulated areas of the empire. Economically, the empire was sustained through a tribute system. Conquered states were allowed a degree of autonomy but had to send wealth, like cattle, grain, metal, and manpower, to the Assyrian court. This system enriched the central government and reinforced the hierarchy of control. Tribute was not just a form of taxation, it was a symbolic submission, a constant reminder of who held power. Assyrian kings portrayed themselves as both divine agents and warrior administrators. Their inscriptions emphasized their military victories, as well as architectural achievements and loyalty to the gods. Power politics was embedded in every aspect of their rule, from ideology and religion to economics and warfare, creating a model of empire that was both feared and remarkably efficient, until overextension and rebellion finally led it to its fall. The Babylonian Empire, especially under Hammurabi, offers a contrast in that it leaned heavily into legal and ideological legitimacy to assert dominance. Hammurabi's famous code wasn't merely a set of laws. It was a political tool that helped unify a culturally diverse region under one moral and administrative framework. The code's emphasis on justice, hierarchy, and retribution mirrored the king's desire to maintain social order and control through rule of law rather than brute force alone. Hammurabi also used religious symbolism to solidify his authority. The prologue of the Code of Hammurabi claims that the laws were given to him by the god Marduk, elevating his rule to divine status. By tying governance to divine will, Hammurabi ensured that disobedience was not just political rebellion, but sacrilege. This fusion of religion and law was a powerful mechanism for social control. In foreign affairs, Babylon employed diplomacy strategically. Hammurabi formed alliances with nearby kingdoms to isolate his enemies and strengthen his position. These alliances were often sealed through political marriages or religious agreements. But when diplomacy had run its course, Hammurabi was not hesitant to use force. His later campaigns showed the use of swift and targeted military strikes to consolidate power over Mesopotamia. Like the Assyrians, the Babylonians also utilized tribute systems and economic pressure. Subjugated regions were required to contribute wealth and resources to Babylon, which not only sustained the capital, but reaffirmed its superior status. This economic dependency kept vassal states in line, especially when paired with threats of military reprisal for noncompliance. The legacy of Babylonian power politics lies in its blend of coercion, law, diplomacy, and ideology. Unlike the Assyrians, who ruled through fear, the Babylonians sought to embed their dominance in institutions and beliefs that would endure even beyond their military conquests. This softer but still hierarchical model of control helped Babylon become a cultural and political hub for centuries. The Persian Empire under the Achaemenid dynasty stands out for its strategic use of tolerance and administrative sophistication. Cyrus the Great's conquests were swift and effective, but what set him apart was his post-conquest strategy. Instead of imposing a uniform rule, he allowed local customs, languages, and religions to continue. This earned him the loyalty of many conquered people, including the Israelites, whom he famously allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Darius I expanded and refined this system. He divided the empire into satrapies, each governed by a satrap who had relative autonomy but was closely monitored by royal inspectors. This decentralized model allowed the Persians to govern a vast and diverse empire while retaining central authority. The satraps collected taxes, enforced laws, and maintained local armies, but they were ultimately accountable to the king. The royal road and a standardized system of coinage and weights helped to unify the empire economically. Communication between the far reaches of the empire and the capital at Persepolis was facilitated by a postal relay system, similar to that of the Assyrians, but on a larger scale. These infrastructure projects weren't just practical, they reinforced the presence of the empire in the daily lives of its subjects. The Persians also invested in symbolic displays of imperial unity. Grand building projects such as the palaces at Persepolis and the use of imperial iconography, like the winged disc and images of tribute bearers, emphasized the diversity and harmony of the empire under Persian rule. Power politics here meant not just domination, but persuasion, convincing subjects that life under Persian rule was orderly, just, and beneficial. While the Persian military remains formidable, especially under Xerxes and Darius, its primary role was deterrence and defense. The Persians rarely ruled through terror. Their model of power politics relied more on bureaucratic control, as well as symbolic legitimacy and economic integration than on overt coercion. This formula helped sustain one of the largest and most enduring empires of the ancient world. The Greek world, fragmented into competitive city-states, offers a different model of power politics, one marked by shifting alliances, ideological rivalries, and a balance of power systems. Athens and Sparta emerged as dominant polis, each representing different political ideals: democracy in Athens and militarism in Sparta. Their rivalry culminated in the Peloponnesian War, a conflict driven as much by ideological competition as by strategic concerns. Athens' use of the Delian League illustrates how a defensive alliance can evolve into an imperial tool. Originally formed to protect against Persian aggression, Athens began to coerce member states into staying in the league, extracting tributes and stationing garrisons. The league's treasury was moved to Athens, funding grand construction projects like the Parthenon. This shift from cooperative defense to imperial control illustrates how power politics can masquerade as mutual interests. Sparta, by contrast, maintained dominance through a rigid militarized society and a network of oligarchic allies. While not as economically expansive as Athens, Sparta used intimidation and elite cohesion to preserve its influence in the Peloponnesian League. Its conservative approach to expansion meant fewer revolts, but also limited cultural integration. Diplomacy in the Greek world was often fluid, with city-states forming and breaking alliances depending on shifting interests. Treaties, marriages, and religious festivals were all political tools. But when diplomacy failed, warfare was frequent and devastating. The Greeks developed complex political theories around balance of power and deterrence, anticipating modern realist concepts of international relations. Despite internal divisions, the Greeks also demonstrated collective power politics during events like the Persian Wars. Temporary units allowed them to repel foreign invasions, showcasing how even competitive states can coordinate when facing a larger threat. However, the lack of a unified system ultimately made Greece vulnerable to Macedonian conquest under Philip II and Alexander the Great. The Roman Empire perfected the blend of hard and soft power, expanding through military conquests but sustaining control through legal, infrastructural, and cultural integration. Rome's legions were not only skilled in combat, they were also builders of roads, forts, and cities, ensuring both control and economic connectivity across the empire. Military colonies helped pacify regions while spreading Roman culture and loyalty. One of Rome's most effective political tools was its approach to citizenship. Conquered peoples could gradually earn the rights and protections of Roman citizens, creating an incentive for loyalty and cooperation. This inclusive policy helped prevent rebellions and facilitated assimilation without constant military oversight. Rome's legal system provided another layer of control. The codification of laws and the creation of a universal legal language allowed Rome to administer justice across culturally diverse regions. These laws reinforced the supremacy of Roman authority, while providing a sense of order and predictability for its subjects. Economically, Rome maintained control through taxation, land redistribution, and a vast slave economy. The grain supply, especially from Egypt, was tightly regulated to prevent shortages in Rome and other key cities. This economic centralization reinforced political power, ensuring that disloyal regions could be punished through embargo or exclusion from trade networks. Rome also invested heavily in symbolic power. Triumphal processions, imperial architecture, and public games projected an image of invincibility and divine favor. The emperor was portrayed not just as a political leader, but as a semi-divine figure, especially after Augustus. This ideological control complemented military strength and legal authority, helping Rome maintain its dominance for centuries. By the Middle Ages, monarchs refined their use of power politics, employing a blend of military force, religious authority, and diplomatic strategy to consolidate and expand their influence. These strategies were no longer solely about battlefield dominance. They became deeply intertwined with statecraft, dynastic claims, and ideological control. Religion, in particular, became a powerful tool not just for spiritual legitimacy, but for consolidating political authority. As centralized monarchies emerged across Europe, rulers became increasingly adept at leveraging every available mechanism to assert dominance both at home and abroad. King Henry VIII of England exemplified this approach. His decision to sever ties with the Catholic Church was not only born of personal and theological motivations, but was a deeply strategic political maneuver. Through the 1534 Act of Supremacy, he positioned himself as the head of a national church, effectively removing foreign, papal, influence from English politics. The ensuing dissolution of the monasteries allowed Henry to redistribute vast religious wealth and land to loyal nobles, binding them to his regime and expanding the crown's control over the economy. This redefinition of religious authority gave the monarchy unprecedented power and set the stage for a distinctly English form of political theology. In France, King Louis XIV used absolutism as his central doctrine, projecting French power not only through military campaigns but through elaborate court rituals, architectural grandeur, and a carefully curated image of divine kingship. His wars, including the War of Devolution, the Dutch War, and the War of the Spanish Succession, were waged to assert dynastic claim and undermine rival powers like Spain and the Habsburgs. Yet Louis also used diplomacy to fortify France's position, crafting alliances and marrying into influential royal houses. His construction of Versailles serves not just as a royal residence, but as a political tool, symbolizing central authority while physically containing the nobility under royal surveillance. Philip II of Spain embodied a more austere but less aggressive form of power politics. His reign coincided with the height of the Spanish imperial dominance, powered by wealth from the Americas and a deeply Catholic worldview. Philip saw himself as the defender of the faith, and his policies were shaped by religious orthodoxy. The suppression of Protestantism in the Spanish Netherlands sparked the Dutch Revolt, a decades-long conflict that drained Spanish resources and strained its military capacity. Meanwhile, his 1588 campaign against Protestant England, the infamous Spanish Armada, was as much about religious rivalry as geopolitical strategy. Though the Armada failed, it symbolized the high-stakes nature of religious and dynastic competition in early modern Europe. These monarchs operated in a world where legitimacy was increasingly tied to control of religious institutions, control of succession, and the projection of national strength. Diplomacy was as much a battlefield as any military campaign, and marriages, treaties, and papal dispensations were wielded as instruments of realpolitik. Power politics during this era was deeply layered, operating through courts, churches, and cabinets, as much as through fortresses and armies. Their reigns revealed a sophisticated understanding of statecraft. Whether it was Henry's reconfiguration of religious authority, Louis's performance of absolutism, or Philip's militant Catholicism, each ruler blended ideology with coercion in strategic ways. They didn't simply react to political challenges. They reshaped institutions to serve their own consolidation of power. The age of chivalry may have romanticized monarchy, but behind the grandeur lay the calculated machinery of power politics, sharper and more complex than ever before. In the 20th century, power politics underwent a profound transformation, evolving into a complex interplay of industrial capacity, ideological confrontation, global institutions, and strategic alliances. Unlike earlier centuries, where dominance was asserted primarily through territorial conquest and dynastic claims, modern states began to compete over influence within global systems, economic, ideological, and military. The two world wars and the Cold War marked key phases in this evolution, where power politics became industrialized, globalized, and ideologically polarized. World War I was not simply sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It was the outcome of decades of imperial competition, nationalistic fervor, and an entrenched belief in militarism. The pre-war arms race, especially between Britain's Royal Navy and Germany's expanding fleet, had heightened tensions. Meanwhile, the Balkan Peninsula, known as the powder keg of Europe, was destabilized by nationalist uprisings and the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Once Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, alliance obligations pulled in all the major powers. Entrenched warfare, mechanized combat, and the use of tanks and chemical weapons turned the conflict into a war of attrition. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 redrew borders and imposed harsh reparations on Germany, sowing resentment that would later fuel extremism. World War II brought an even more ideologically charged and totalizing version of power politics. Nazi Germany sought to overturn the post-Versailles order through a radical ethno-nationalist and expansionist ideology. The invasion of Poland in 1939, followed by blitzkrieg across Western Europe, revealed a new form of rapid mechanized warfare. Japan's simultaneous imperial ambitions in China and Southeast Asia created a two-front conflict that soon spanned the globe. The war was fought not just with armies, but with entire economies and societies mobilized for total war. The Holocaust and other atrocities reflected the ideological extremism that drove the Axis powers. On the Allied side, wartime conferences like Yalta and Tehran were arenas of strategic negotiation, where the post-war world was being shaped even before the fighting ended. The war concluded with the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, introducing a new kind of destructive power and signaling a dramatic shift in global military capability. The Cold War that followed was an era defined by indirect conflict, strategic deterrence, and compelling visions of world order. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as two superpowers, each promoting their respective ideologies: liberal democracy and capitalism versus Marxist-Leninist communism. While they avoided direct confrontation, the superpowers engaged in an arms race that produced tens of thousands of nuclear warheads. Proxy wars became the primary battlegrounds in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, and Latin America. Each side funded and armed local actors to expand their sphere of influence. Institutions like NATO, the Warsaw Pact, the United Nations, and the non-aligned movement reflected the global scope of this rivalry. Espionage, disinformation campaigns, and propaganda were tools of statecraft as much as tanks or missiles. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 marked one of the most perilous moments of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast, President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade and demanded their removal. The standoff brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Yet it also showcased the increasing sophistication of Cold War diplomacy. Through secret back channels, both sides reached a compromise. The USSR would withdraw its missiles from Cuba, and the US would quietly remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. This moment underscored how symbolic and geographic influence could nearly trigger global catastrophe, while also highlighting the critical role of communication and de-escalation. Throughout the 20th century, power politics became multidimensional. It was no longer about who controlled the most territory. It was about who shaped the world's rules, economies, and ideologies. The US used institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to export a liberal economic model, while the Soviets offered alternative development paths through Comecon and ideological education. Cultural power also emerged as a geopolitical tool. American music, movies, and consumer goods became symbols of freedom and prosperity, while Soviet athletic dominance, space exploration, and ideological education sought to demonstrate the virtues of communism. By century's end, The Cold War concluded with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The US emerged as the world's sole superpower, at least temporarily, ushering in a unipolar moment. Yet, the century had demonstrated that power politics was no longer about the mere control of land. It was about shaping systems, economic institutions, security frameworks, ideological narratives, and access to global resources like oil and technology. These lessons continue to inform state behavior in the 21st century, as newer powers like China and regional players like Russia seek to challenge the systems established during the American-led liberal order. The 20th century, in many ways, set the template for how power is pursued and contested today. In part 2 of this series, we'll move beyond the Cold War to explore how power politics adapted in the post-Soviet world. We'll look at how the unipolar moment gave way to multipolar friction, how new institutions and old rivalries shaped international behavior, and how global power is now being contested not only through military strength, but through economic warfare, digital influence, and multilateral maneuvering. From Joe Biden's commitment to alliances and democratic values, to Donald Trump's transactional America First diplomacy, to Ursula von der Leyen's institutional assertiveness, and Annalena Baerbock's blend of climate policy and feminist diplomacy, we'll analyze how today's key figures are reshaping the contours of global power in an increasingly complex world.